Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Robert Waldinger and Arthur Brooks. Thanks for joining us. FAN celebrates its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We're committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. So now for some introductions. Dr. Bob Waldinger is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, director of the Center for Psychodynamic Therapy and Research at Massachusetts General Hospital, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, and co-founder of the Lifespan Research Foundation. The study has documented the lives of two groups of men for over 80 years. Dr. Waldinger is now beginning a study of the more than 2,000 baby boomer children of these men to examine how childhood experience affects midlife health and well-being. His 2016 TEDx talk, What Makes a Good Life? Lessons from the Longest Study on Happiness, has over 42 million views, placing it in the top 10 of all TED Talks. And his brand new book, The Good Life, has just debuted in the number 3 spot on the New York Times bestseller list. How fantastic for him. We're now honored also to welcome back Arthur Brooks, the Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of Management Practice at the Harvard Business School. Before joining the Harvard faculty in July of 2019, he served for 10 years as president of the Washington, D.C.-based American Enterprise Institute, one of the world's leading think tanks. Professor Brooks is the author of many books, including his most recent bestseller, From Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life. He is also a columnist for The Atlantic, host of the Atlantic podcast, How to Build a Happy Life, and subject of the 2019 documentary film, The Pursuit, which Variety named as one of the best documentaries on Netflix. And now let's welcome Bob Waldinger and Arthur Brooks.
Thank you, Lonnie. And hi, Bob Waldinger, my friend.
It is so good to be here with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So good to be with you virtually. And this is one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. Is part of the good life being on Zoom, or do we need to be together? But let's wait on that question, because that's one of the answers that we're going to need to get in this post-COVID environment. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. I know we have a really large crowd. And the reason, Bob, is because your book is a big, big hit. Now, we heard your incredible biography that comes. I mean, it's not enough, apparently, to be a professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and to be at one of the greatest hospitals in the world, and also to be a practicing psychoanalyst and a Zen Buddhist priest. You're also doing work in the public education sphere, not just the TED Talk that you did, but working with the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which we'll talk about in a minute, to get these ideas out. And most notably now with your runaway bestseller on the topic. I can't wait to dig in on this and get some very practical ideas for our audience on how the best data in the world can help all of us design our best life. So let's start right there. I want to start by actually talking about this data set. I realize, folks, don't turn off the webcast, but you need to understand why this is such an incredibly powerful data set. Tell us about the Harvard Study of Adult Development that you write about.
It is the longest study of adult life that has ever been done. We're in our 85th year, and we are still collecting data as we speak. And it started in 1938 with two groups, a very privileged group of Harvard College sophomores, 19-year-olds, and it was meant to be a study of adult development and thriving. So you study Harvard undergraduates. We don't do that anymore. We study more diverse samples. But at that time, that was the way to look at healthy adult development. And in addition, a Harvard Law School professor, Sheldon Gluck, and his wife, Eleanor Gluck, a social worker, did a study of kids from Boston's poorest families and most troubled families to try to understand how some children who were born with so many strikes against them managed to stay out of trouble, to stay on good developmental paths. And so both of these studies, started in 1938, were about human thriving, and that was radical. And then, of course, what's so unique is that nobody ever imagined that this study would last 85 years, maybe 10 years. Most longitudinal studies fall apart before the 10-year mark. We have had less than 20% dropout over 85 years. We have these 724 families who are still part of our scientific community.
So this has been going on for 85 years. And now, just so that our audience understands the power of this, one of the things that my students at Harvard ask me, I teach classes in the science of happiness. And one of the things they want to know is, what can I do now to increase the odds that I'm going to be happy later? And they want a crystal ball. Well, Bob, you have a crystal ball, because you've been looking not at average 19-year-olds, you've been looking at the same people. What were they doing in their 20s? What were they doing in their 30s? And then what did they look like in their, not literally, how was their life? Were they happy? Were they healthy in their 60s and 70s and 80s? This is incredible power. Nothing like this has ever been actually produced before. Okay, now before we talk about what you found, because that's the whole point, what are the study's limitations? I mean, what are the limitations of these data, so we can get our minds around that too?
Absolutely. So the first limitation was that it was all male, and we quickly corrected that. We brought in the spouses of our first generation, and then we studied all the children, more than half of whom are female. So we've now got gender balance, but we only have white people, because in 1938, the city of Boston was 97% Caucasian. If you want to start a study in Boston in 1938, that's what you get. So what we've done is looked at many, many other studies with more diverse and inclusive samples. And what we present to people, and what I'm going to talk about tonight, are all findings that we know are true for other demographic groups, other racial groups. So that's how we make sure that we don't limit what we present to just a small group of Caucasians.
Now, as social scientists, this is just critically important to understand that when you limit a sample to a particular group, you might be finding something that's unique to that group, and that gives you skewed results. One of the beautiful things about the study of happiness, which is my field and your field as well, is that it almost doesn't matter. Happiness is happiness and love is love, because people are people. One of the most beautiful things about what we study is that you can study any race, you can study both sexes, and there's not that much variation, because we're all people and we want the same thing. But you have corrected for that specifically and explicitly to make sure that there's a lot of confidence. Okay, now let's start getting to the incredible results from this. But I want to ask this first question, and this is something that I think everybody should always ask the author of a book, right? Which is this: if you have just 2 or 3 sentences about this whole study and this whole book, this is your elevator speech about why this matters, what's the big takeaway?
The big takeaway is that following the same people through their whole lives allows us to see what happens to people, rather than making these false connections, which we often make when we just take snapshots of 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds. And so what's unique about this is having these life stories that go on for 85 years. So let me take a shot at my reading, and you tell me if this is wrong, of the one thing we need to know from your book. Okay? Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Happiness is love. Full stop.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So we actually found 2 big takeaways, but one will not surprise anybody here tonight. And that is, taking care of your health really matters. Taking care of your body. All those things that our grandmothers told us, that's true. But what we did not expect, and this is what the book is all about, is the finding that began to emerge that the people who stayed healthy and lived the longest were the people who had the warmest connections with other people as they went through their lives. That the people who prioritized their relationships were not just happy, that makes sense, but they were healthy. They were less likely to get type 2 diabetes. They were less likely to get heart disease, arthritis. And so we've been spending the last 10 years trying to understand how exactly that works, because as a scientist, I want to know, well, how could that possibly be the case? How could the warmth of your connections in the world change your physiology and protect you.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because the way that this is set up is that you can think of it as people in 4 quadrants when they're old: well and unwell in terms of their health, and happy and unhappy. And what you want to be is in that quadrant that's happy and well. That's how you like to put it in all of your research: happy and well. And you look for the people in there, and what you find overwhelmingly, they have strong relationships, strong love relationships. Furthermore, this is something that you say in the book: they don't push love away. And this is one of the key things. So let me get to this next, because this is something that's really salient in your work. Look, this should be something that grandma told us and that we all know. And yet, when I was a kid, I remember, I don't remember the 60s really. Woodstock happened when I was 5, and, my parents wouldn't let me go, squares. But I remember my dad, because he had heard on TV this hippie saying that if it feels good, do it. And my dad said, that's the end of America.
Right.
Maybe right. Anyway, the point is that if you do what feels right and the impulses that you get, and if you follow Mother Nature, you're in trouble, because a lot of the things that you're telling us are things that people don't often do. Why don't we do these things, Bob?
Well, we're bad at knowing what will make us happy. And there's a lot of good research on this. I'll give you an example. They did a study in which they asked some people to talk to strangers on the subway. And they told other people, just do what you usually do, keep to yourself. And the people who were assigned to talk to strangers thought they were going to hate it. But when the assignment was over and they asked people, how did you like that? The people who talked to strangers were much happier than the people who didn't. And that's just an example of how we're bad at predicting what's going to make us happy.
Yeah.
We often feel like, I don't want to go out to this party. I don't want to make plans with a friend. I want to stay home. I want to watch Netflix. I want to stay on social media. And so that inertia to stay to ourselves is really something to be overcome and to be worked on. Just like physical fitness takes effort and constant attention, we talk about social fitness in the book as a practice that people can learn to do better.
This is very interesting. Now, the work that you're talking about talking to people in the subway, that's the work of Nick Epley at the University of Chicago. So for all of our Chicago friends, that's work that's going on right down the street. And it's incredible because it shows that your instincts lie to you when it comes to love. People push away love all the time. People avoid love all the time because it seems awkward. It doesn't feel comfortable. And so they don't actually make these investments. And this is one of the key points that you keep bringing up again and again and again is make the effort, make the investment, right?
Yes. And there are small things we can do. This doesn't have to be a big, big effort. So tonight, people who are listening to this right now could think about somebody you miss. Think about somebody you haven't seen in a while, haven't connected with in a while. Take out your phone, send a text, send an email saying, hi, I was thinking of you and just wanted to say hello. Just do that. What you will see is that 9 times out of 10, you will get back a really enthusiastic response. And when I ask people to do this, like when I'm giving a talk and I ask people to do it, then during the question and answer, I say, did anybody get anything back? And people will say, oh, my friend was so glad I reached out. We have a date for dinner next week. Or my friend was sick and it meant so much that I texted him.
Yeah, no, this is important. I love that. And one of the ways to systematize this, by the way, one of the things that I recommend that my students do, my graduate students do, is that they start each day and it's the 2 texts on the first thing on your to-do list. It takes no time at all. 2 people. And one of the texts should be, I was just thinking about you. And the other is, I saw this thing that you did and it was really great. So in other words, it's a hello and a compliment every morning, a hello and a compliment to start your day. And it reprograms you, because this is a key point that you're bringing up about all the people who wind up happy and well, who get these protocols. And by the way, this book is your happiness 401k plan, friends. But here's the deal. In a real like I'm an economist, so, I confess, a real 401k plan requires that you sacrifice right now so you can consume later. Bob Waldinger's happiness 401k plan means that you can be happier now and happier later. You just have to get over some of these things. And here's the key point in all of this, so that you can be happy and well more now and a lot more when you get old. The key thing is this: you don't wait for love. This is the point that you bring it again and again and again. You give what you want to get when it actually comes to love. You need to be the one who reaches out. This is how you get the ball started. This is almost it's almost a law of attraction, right?
Yeah. And, you're saying that, which we find, that you can be happier now, this week, tomorrow, by doing these little things to connect with people, to appreciate people. But in addition, it's a kind of insurance policy. So our original subjects, participants, went through the Great Depression. They went through World War II. Many of them, were buffeted by the upheavals of the 60s. And we asked them, how did you get through these really difficult times, which happened to all of us? And to a person, they said something about their relationships. What we find is that people rely on these strong relationships when hard times come along, and they come to all of us. And so it's not just a way to make yourself happier, it's a way to buffer yourself from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, which are always heading our way.
The modern research on the neuroscience of loneliness actually starts to explain some of these mechanisms, which you know better than anybody, but our audience might not be as familiar with it. One of the things that we know is when you're lonely, that impairs your executive function and you do the opposite of what you need to do. So I'm feeling really lonely. Nobody loves me. Nobody's reaching out to me. Maybe I'm living in a new city. I'll cocoon on the couch with some Haagen-Dazs, watching Netflix and a comfy blanket. Wrong. Get out of the house, go ride your bike, get some sunlight in your eyes, call a friend, reach out. It's interesting that since reading a lot of this literature, I've moved 19 times in the past 31 years. I'm not on the lam, but I move a lot. And so what my wife and I do is to take this seriously. We moved to a new place. We start inviting people over to our house by about 2 weeks in. Why? Because we're doing what we want. We're giving what we want to get. It's a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And let's say you're not comfortable doing what you just talked about, Arthur. Let's say you're a shy person, or
Right.
You're a person who feels like, oh, people don't really want to be with me. There are a couple of things we know actually work. One is to do something you like, something you care about, alongside other people. It could be, a gardening club. It could be a volunteer for a political campaign, could be anything. But if you volunteer alongside other people, what you do is you collect a group of people with whom you already have something in common, a shared passion, and then you see those people again and again, and you start having conversations. First, more superficial conversations, but then gradually deeper conversations with maybe one or two people. And that's how friendships develop. Science tells us that's the way they develop. Another way you can do it, if you're not so comfortable with this, is find a way to be of service. So volunteer your energy, your ability. You could volunteer at a food pantry. You could teach English as a second language to people who are desperately in need of your skills because they want to learn English. You could read to children. They have these programs now where older adults read to preschoolers, and everybody is thrilled. The preschoolers adore it. The older adults love it. So finding ways to be of service is another way that you can overcome that fear that you don't have much to offer, or that people don't want to be with you.
So this, friends, is the big point. This is the big takeaway. Love more, love intensively, do the work, get over the awkwardness, and you shall reap the rewards. This is what, but of course, the book says a lot more. And the book motivates these points with these very vivid real life stories. So let's get into one of those, Bob.
Yeah.
Tell us the story of John Marsden and Leo DeMarco, and how one had the perfect life, but the story turns out and has a twist in it we're not expecting.
Yeah. So John and Leo Leo was our happiest man in the study, like literally on the scales.
Did you meet him? Did you meet him? Did you meet him?
I did meet him.
Yeah.
What a lovely man. And now I've met his children. and I met his spouse. He's since passed away.
Right.
And John was our least happy man. And the interesting thing about them is they were both Harvard College undergraduates. So they started out with privilege, and they started out, we thought, set up to have the best lives. And they went such divergent ways. Leo wanted to be a writer, and he had dreams, and he went off to war, came back with a distinguished service record, but he needed to take care of his aging parents. So he came back home. He needed to support everybody. So he got a job as a history teacher. He spent his whole career as a high school history teacher.
And he didn't want this. He was reluctant. He had to go to Vermont, which is off the beaten path. He didn't want any of this. Right.
Yeah. It turned out he loved his students. He loved his colleagues. He had a happy marriage. He had 3 daughters who adored him. The other person, John, was supposed to be very much the successful man. He went to law school, became quite a distinguished lawyer, won some awards, made much more money than Leo, like orders of magnitude more. But John was always reluctant to be with people. He always felt he didn't fit in. He ended up not just with one unhappy marriage, but a second unhappy marriage. He shunned relationships. He pushed love away, as you're saying, Arthur. And over time, he settled into chronic disability and had a very unhappy later life. Both of these men started out with all the privilege you could want and all the advantages you could want. And the other thing about that is that, of course, we studied 2/3 of the families we study were from Boston's most underprivileged and under-resourced families. They were no less happy on average than the Harvard people. And that's really important. They made much less money on average, but their levels of happiness were absolutely the same. We had some very unhappy people in both groups and some very happy people. And much of it had to do with the way they lived their social lives.
Now, we know from modern research on identical twins that have been separated at birth and reunited as adults, that who are carbon copies of their DNA, that about 50% of our happiness is genetic. So how much do you see that in this study? I mean, 50% genetic is not nothing. I mean, think about this, folks. What I'm saying, your mother literally made you unhappy or happy. Your results may vary. How much of the genetics are you seeing showing up in this? And how much do you think is choices?
Well, we all know people who are Tiggers, who are bouncy and happy and cheerful.
They're very annoying. Yeah.
Yeah, they're very annoying. So I get accused of that sometimes because I live in Iowa, and that's kind of a thing, there's.
Yeah, you're from Des Moines, Iowa, by the way.
Yeah. But then, there are Eeyores. There are the people who are more glum.
We Seattleites. Yeah.
Yeah. And what we find is that there is something that they call in research a hedonic set point, a kind of baseline level of happiness that could be high or low. And we think that a lot of that has to do with inborn temperament, probably controlled by so many different genes that we will never find even a specific handful of genes that control happiness, because it's so multiply determined, but it is determined. So you know this work, Arthur, better than I, but they do studies of people who win the lottery. Right. How happy were they before and how happy are they a year later? And people who have terrible accidents and become paralyzed, how happy were they before? How happy a year later? What they find is that the lottery winners and the paraplegics return to their baseline levels of happiness a year later on average.
Right.
And so what that tells us is that there is a kind of set point. But that said, what Sonia Lubomirsky's work says is that 10%, she estimates, of our happiness is based on our current life situation. Like what's happening to me right now in my life.
Circumstance, right.
Circumstance. But then 40% is under our control. And 40% is not nothing. There's a lot we can move in terms of changing our level of happiness.
Yeah, no, it's an important thing to keep in mind too. I mean, my own estimates are this 50, 25, 25, based on sort of the meta-analysis of the research. 50% is genetic, 25% is your current circumstances, and 25% is your actual habits. But here's the key thing to keep in mind. If I said, which is true, that 50% of your likelihood of abusing alcohol is genetic, that's true, by the way. And then you said to me, it's like, Arthur, I got a problem. I said, what's your problem, Bob? He says, I'm going to be a drunk. Mom was a drunk. Dad was a drunk. My 4 grandparents were drunks. I'd say, Bob, I got a super secret technology for you. It's called don't drink. The point is that habits are switches.
Yeah.
DNA is proclivities. The same thing about circumstances. Look, circumstances really matter, good or bad, but they don't last. And what you need to do is to manage them so they're systematically better, which is also your habits. So that 25% is actually everything. And that's why your book is so critically important. You need to know your genetics and tailor your habits to them. You need to fix your circumstances as best you can, and then directly control that 25% or 40% or whatever it happens to be, right?
Yeah. But, to that point, Arthur, that's a really good point, because when we think about, people often ask me, well, how many friends do you need? What's the right number? There is no right number, because depending on our temperament, if we're shy, then we need fewer friends, and that's fine. If we're extroverts, then people energize us. We need more people in our lives. And so it's highly individual how many connections work for you. And that's important to name, because we're not claiming that everybody needs to go out and be a party animal. Not at all. What we do think is that everybody needs at least one relationship where they feel the person has their back. So, example from our study, we asked people at one point, who could you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared? List everybody. And most of our people could list a number of people, but some of our participants couldn't list anybody. And some of those participants were married and they couldn't list anybody. So what we believe is that everybody, whether you're shy or extroverted or somewhere in between, everybody needs at least one relationship where you feel like that person has your back in times of trouble.
Yeah, no, one of the things that you point out in the research in this book, but also in your academic research, is that the happiest people, they have a good companionate relationship with their spouse. If they're married, that they have a very close relationship with their spouse. And that's important. My students don't quite understand that. They think that passion is the vehicular language of a happy marriage. It's not. It's companionate love, which my son, I told him that, he says, like, Dad, that's not hot.
But not hot, exactly.
But, companionate love is still got, I mean, you and I have been married men for a really long time, and it's still very passionate. But the point is best friends. But you point this out in your work as well. The happiest people have at least one friend who's not the spouse too, right?
Yeah.
That's super important, isn't it?
It's really important that we've somehow developed this myth of that we should be able to get everything we need from one relationship, from our spouse, from our primary partner. And that is just not the truth for almost any couple. And so there's nothing wrong with your relationship. In fact, there's a lot right with your relationship if you allow each other to get other things from other people.
Yeah.
Family members, friends, work colleagues, community members, all of that. So this myth that we have to get it all from our spouse is something we really want to put aside and start cultivating more relationships.
Now, most of the people in the book and most of the people in the study who are really happy, they are married and they have a good marriage, right? I mean, that's just phenomenal. It's really fantastic. It's really hard to be in the happy wall quadrant if you're in continuously a bad marriage, because that sort of tension is hard, right?
Yeah. But, though that was the World War II generation,
right?
When 93% of those 724 men got married.
Right.
Now there are many different paths and it's much more socially acceptable to take different paths besides marriage. I'm still a proponent of marriage because it has worked for me, but we know many, many people whose lives we've followed who have wonderful relationships and are not married. And what we find is that it is quite possible to take a different path as long as you have warm, close connections and be quite happy.
Now, one of the things that worries me, and I think it worries you too, however, is that we see a falling rate of romantic involvement of people in their 20s today. You find that people in their 20s today are a third less likely to say they're in love than you and I were when we were in our 20s. They're about half as likely to be married, and they're less likely to cohabitate. They're even having less sex.
Right.
This is worrisome because loneliness rates are going up very quickly for people in their 20s and 30s, right? Can you speak to that?
Exactly. Yes. And a lot of what we think about is, first of all, it's a pandemic of loneliness that 1 in 3 people around the world will say that they are lonely.
Right.
It's a terrifying statistic given the health consequences as well as the happiness consequences.
Right.
But what we know is that every time there are these big leaps forward in particularly entertainment technology, our connections with each other diminish. So Robert Putnam did a lot of work, as you know, on this and found that in the 1950s in the United States, our connections with each other, our investment in other people went way down as television was introduced into the American home and everybody stayed home and stared at a screen.
Right.
So that includes houses of worship, that includes joining clubs, that includes inviting people over, includes family dinners. We know how impactful those are for well-being. Then in the early 2000s, when Putnam's research group went back and surveyed, there was a dramatic drop again. It got much worse. And that probably has to do with the advent of smartphones and tablets and laptops. So now most of us are not just on one screen at once, we're actually often on 2 or 3 screens at the same time. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, my wife and I do this. We'll go down to breakfast and we'll realize that we haven't even looked at each other. She's looking at her email and I'm scrolling through the news on my phone. And this
terrible.
is the new normal. And I'm the man who's advocating paying attention to each other and relationship strengthening.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. So for the young people who are watching this is I have some very actionable takeaways. What we're saying so far, and I'm going to move on here in a second because I've got some other questions for you before we talk to the audience here, is that there's kind of 3 columns where you can get these love relationships that are going to help you age happy and well. There's romance, there's friendship, and there's family. These are the 3, right? Pick as many as you can from as many columns as possible and don't push away anything. If you don't get something from column A, go to column B. Do not cut off relationships with your family for any reason besides abuse. And by the way, abuse does not include political opinion differences.
That's right.
And
now
go ahead.
And let me add to what you say. So you're right. So it's romance, it's family, it's friends, but also think about your work life, because what we find is that if you have a friend at work, you're happier, you're more productive, you do better at your job, you're less likely to be disengaged, you're less likely to leave your job. So having a friend at work or more than one friend really matters. The other thing is talk to those people that you see during the day. Talk to the person who gives you your coffee at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks. Call them by name, look at their name tag, look them in the eye. Talk to the person who checks you out at the grocery store, the person who delivers your mail. That those connections, even though they're casual, give us little hits of well-being when we cultivate them.
Now, before I'm gonna leave the topic of love here for a second. We're gonna come back to it, obviously, because it's the salient topic. Love is the whole show. It's love, love, and more love. I mean, this is like the summer of love. This is Bob Waldinger's 2022 Summer of Love.
You're just trying to recreate what you missed out on at age 5, not getting to go to Woodstock. I see that.
I know, man. I'm telling you, this is a real love experience reading this book, and it's a beautiful book. Everybody's got to read this book. Tons of data, very smart and easy to read, which is a wonderful thing. It's a masterful combination. Okay. There's some other things besides love in it, however. So let's talk for a minute about the other things to do besides romance, family, and friendship that people should cultivate over the course of their lives so that they can age better, happier, and be healthier as they grow older. So the predecessor who directed this study, George Valiant, who directed the study for about 30 years before you. So the two of you have been running it for about 65 years between you, which is pretty incredible
Yeah.
longevity of the study. So George Valiant talked about sort of the big 7 things that people can do to get into the happy, well quadrant, the biggest of which is love. But there's another 6 as well. So can we go through those really quickly just to talk about them?
I don't have the list
I've got it in my head. Don't worry. I'm ready. I'm ready.
All right, let's go through.
Okay, so the first 4 are pretty obvious and people miss them all the time, but everybody kind of knows it's smoking, drinking, eating, and exercising.
Oh yeah.
Those are super important. Now, don't smoke. If you're smoking, quit. Number 2 is if you drink less, because anything that you think is moderate is probably heavier than moderate is the bottom line. And you show in your work that drinking has a hugely deleterious impact on love.
Huge. More than half of the marriages that broke up in our study broke up because one or both people were alcoholic.
So this is the key causality and folks on this study. People's like, my wife drives me to drink. No. Your drinking drives you to have a bad relationship with your wife.
Exactly.
That's what's actually going on.
And that's what's cool. So we can do some of the chicken and egg analyses. It's that drinking comes first and then marriages fall apart.
Yep.
Not that bad marriages drive you to drink.
I love the causality on that study. It just rocks my world. It's incredibly important because the bottom line is, and it's tough advice, by the way, drink less or not at all. Drink minimally or not at all for your happiness and health. And again, this goes against all this wine industry funded research saying that you should have 3 glasses of wine. It's nonsense. It's just not right. And it doesn't stack up if you want to be happy and well. Okay. Number 3 is maintain a healthy body weight without crazy yo-yo diets that make you insane, give you an eating disorder and ruin your life, but maintain a healthy body weight, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's important.
It's really creating healthy lifelong habits,
right?
Not these crash diets and fasts.
Yeah, that's right. It's like I fast 22 hours a day because I saw it on the internet. No. Yeah. Live like a normal person is what it comes down to, which is a beautiful piece of advice, right? Yeah. Okay, and the last is exercise moderately. Once again, you don't have to go insane, but you need to be active. And again, this is not just to be healthy; it's also to be happy.
Yeah. Now, there's another thing I would add, because George Valiant, I don't think had to add this in his time, but we have to add it in our time, which is that we are now bombarded with voices, many voices that try to make us afraid and many voices that try to divide us from each other. And what I would recommend is that we pay careful attention to the language that people use in our public life and the tone that they use. And if someone's presentation makes you feel more afraid and more closed off from the world, turn toward those voices that make you feel more inclusive and more connected to the world. That's now something that's crucial for our well-being.
Right. Yeah, that's right. He didn't, well, who knows? In different times in American history, that's been more salient than others. Yep. The 5th thing that he talks about is having a good coping mechanism with stress and anxiety and worry, that not to become a ruminator. You need to figure out how to deal with your problems in a normal, healthy way, right?
Yeah. And often it's facing toward rather than facing away. Right. It's not burying your head in the sand, but taking on a problem, looking at it, getting help. In my psychiatric training, we were taught the maxim, never worry alone. Right. So and that applies to life. As stresses come our way, as challenges come our way, don't feel like you have to do it all by yourself. Pull aside a friend, a partner, get help, get therapy. There's great therapy out there.
Right.
All of these things can allow us not to ruminate all by ourselves.
That's right. So the bottom line is that life has a lot of tension. Life has a lot of anxiety. It's going to throw a lot of stuff at you. You need a coping mechanism. Maybe it's the faith of your youth, a prayer life, a meditation practice, therapy, walking in nature without devices. Maybe it's studying the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. You do your thing, but you better do something if you want to be in the happy well quadrant, right?
Yeah.
6, keep learning. Active mind. Tell me more about that.
Well, we know now that people who stay cognitively engaged in the world as they get older, we believe stave off cognitive decline. That essentially we've learned that neurons can grow even later in life, we used to think your brain didn't grow. Your brain didn't really change except to decline as you got older. Now we know that's not true. So the more we stimulate ourselves, learning a new language, reading, talking with people is a wonderful stimulus in this way, that the more we stay engaged with the world, the sharper our brains will stay.
And number 7, love, 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 and more love, but we've already talked about that.
Right.
Now, I want to go into a kind of a lightning round here. We've got about 8 minutes before Lonnie comes back and has a couple of questions from the audience. So let's go quickly through a few of these things that some of them you address in the book directly, but a lot of these things are going to be on people's minds that you'll be able to answer with the contents of this book and with this incredible knowledge that comes from 85 years of data. Does living a happy life make it easier to die?
Erik Erikson talked about this, the psychologist who was really the first to look at the stages of adult life.
Right.
And he talked about this idea of integrity versus despair when we get to the end of life. And integrity is looking back on our lives and saying, I've had a decent run. It's been good enough. And despair is that look back that fills me with regret. And I think what we know is that if you've lived a life where you've done the things that were most important to you, that's likely to put you in the integrity category. So we asked our folks when they got to be 80, we said, look back on your life. What was your biggest regret and what were you proudest of? Almost everybody said, my biggest regret was that I didn't spend enough time with the people I care about. And many people said, I spent too much time at work. The other big regret, and this more often voiced by women, was I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying about what other people thought. And then when we flip over to what they were proudest of, to a person, they talked about relationships. They didn't say, I'm proudest that I made a fortune, that I became a CEO, that I became famous. And some of our people did all these things.
Right.
They always said, I was a good partner. I was a good parent. I was a good friend. I was a good boss. You know, there was always about who they connected with and how they were with them. So when we want to think about what are we going to care about as we move toward the end of life, again, think about how you're conducting your relational life right now.
Now, in my eulogy, I want them to talk about how many frequent flyer miles I have. I don't know about the rest of you. Should I get off social media right now?
No. First of all, you might, Arthur, but the world is not going to get off social media. But the research is telling us that how we use social media matters. And so what we find is that people who use social media actively, meaning to connect with others, those people have greater well-being. They're happier. So, for example, a friend of mine during the COVID lockdown reconnected with some of his elementary school friends, and he started having coffee with them on Zoom every Sunday morning. They are thrilled at that reconnection online, through social media. But what we find is that if you passively consume social media, if you scroll through other people's Instagram feeds, other people's curated lives, pictures of beautiful beaches and all that, you get less happy. You compare yourselves to others. You start to have FOMO, this fear of missing out. You start to believe that everybody else has it all figured out and you don't. So the bottom line is active use of social media can enhance well-being. Passive consumption of social media usually makes us more depressed.
Okay, so if social media substitutes for your friendships, you're in trouble. If it complements your friendships, it's good. Can I be happy and get happier even if I have a lot of suffering?
Yes. Because, we are all, that suffering comes our way, right? And yes, suffering is real and it drags our mood down. But I'll give you an example. When we studied our folks as they got older, we did a daily check-in where we asked them, how much pain did you have? How much time did you spend with other people? And when people had pain, their moods got lower, but if they spent more time with other people, they didn't have much in the way of mood dips. In other words, spending time with other people buffered them from some of the slings and arrows, from some of the suffering of life. It doesn't mean that we can escape suffering. It's there for all of us, but that we can buffer ourselves from some of the worst of it.
Did you find people in the happy well quadrant who were really happy and quite well, who nonetheless had a lot of loss and suffering?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And these are people who find ways to work with it, to put it in perspective, people whose religious beliefs, people whose meditation practices, people whose commitment to a purpose larger than the self. All of these things bring a kind of solace and a kind of energy, even in the face of loss and suffering for many people.
This leads to the next question, which is, do I need to be spiritual to get into the happy well quadrant?
No, you don't. We asked people about this, and I would say about half of our people said, I'm not spiritual, religious at all, and the other half were. The two groups did not differ in their levels of happiness.
Did they have a substitute for spirituality, like a life transcendent philosophy?
Yes. Life transcendent philosophy, and also investment in things beyond the self, beyond the sphere of I, me, and mine. That seems really key.
Now, zooming out above yourself is really important, so that you're not, the tedium of me is terrible after 85 years or so, right?
Yeah.
So can I get the love that I need when I'm old from my adult children?
You may or may not. It depends on you and your adult children. And you may have to look elsewhere. In fact, it's often helpful to look elsewhere, even if you are getting love from your adult children. One size never fits all. You know, when you study thousands of lives over 85 years, you learn this lesson. One size never fits all, people.
Before Lonnie comes back, because she's going to come back just here in a second, let's talk about something that really makes this relevant for a lot of people right now, which is the incredible increases of loneliness that we've seen over the past 3 years because of the coronavirus pandemic. We were obliged to stay at home. A lot of people still are, because of autoimmune disorders, or just the fear that they've built up from, the threats to our health. And the result of that is that we have never seen levels of loneliness ever. As scholars, you and I are looking at this. It's an absolute. I talked to the Surgeon General of the United States, and I said, "What's the biggest public health crisis today?" He didn't say coronavirus. He didn't say guns. He didn't say opiates. He didn't say something about the climate. He said loneliness, man. It's about loneliness. So what do you tell us about how to get this back so that we don't all wind up in the unhappy, unwell quadrant?
Well, the problem is that this is not just a function of the pandemic, that loneliness was on the rise big time before COVID hit us. COVID made it worse. But what we think has happened is that this breakdown in social structure has massively contributed to loneliness. So I was recently in India, where they have a tradition of multiple generations living together and needing each other, supporting each other, grandparents raising grandchildren. Similarly, in China, there are those social structures. What happens now, as people move around for work, particularly moving into big cities from smaller villages and towns, that what we find is this tearing of the social fabric, so that everybody is left at loose ends. And many people are quite lonely. The people left behind are lonely, and the people who move into these big anonymous cities are lonely. And so the question is, how do we reestablish social fabric in a way that allows people to feel held by each other? Because right now, this loneliness pandemic is increasing, and a lot of the remedy is going to be in social structures that enhance stable connections.
A quick piece of advice for somebody watching us from home right now who's really lonely in the wake of the pandemic. What can they do literally tonight before they go to bed?
Reach out to somebody and say you'd love to connect. Just, take a risk. Send that text, send that email, or pick up the phone. But sending a text can somehow feel less risky, and that's okay. Don't worry. No need to take big risks. Just take a small step first.
So let's think of something that people can remember, a mnemonic device or something, so they can remember the good quadrant and the bad quadrant, where we want to wind up. And so let me try this out on you and see if you agree. The strategy for getting not where you want to be is following your instincts, loving things, and using people. To get into the good quadrant, don't follow your instincts, friends, or the marketing colossus. You should use things and love people, right?
Yeah. And I'm going to add to the love people part from one of my Zen teachers who said, attention is the most basic form of love. That if we really get ourselves to give our undivided attention to each other, wonderful things happen. And if we keep giving each other partial attention, that's when our relationships get frayed and stale and wither away.
This information from this book has been critical for my happiness. You've given me a much, much better life, a roadmap for what I'm going to try to do. And I'm looking forward to being your colleague for years to come. I hope we have a good life as we grow old as neighbors here in Boston, Massachusetts. You've also blessed the people watching us. I'm going to turn it over to Lonnie right now because she's got a couple of questions from our audience that have been upvoted. So let's hear what's on everybody's mind, Bob.
Yeah.
Arthur, thank you for such an engaged, thoughtful, knowledgeable, expansive, energetic interview. We do a lot of these, and it's always so great when the interview partner is just coming in and bringing it. And really, thank you so much. We appreciate your service to FAN and the community. Thank you very much.
Thanks for what FAN is doing. I mean, this is you're lifting people up and bringing them together. It's really great.
Thank you. And Bob, thank you so much for sharing this work. I know we've only just scratched the surface. It's an 85-year study.
Yep.
We have hit the twinkling lights, and there's so much more to discuss. And I'm looking forward to giving away a bunch of books once we get the attendance report back from Zoom. So we'll have several hundred lucky folks who will be getting a book soon. So now I'm going to flip over to some questions. We'll keep it in, I like the spirit of the lightning round, if you don't mind. So a couple of things that people want to know, and we'll start with a question that's on a lot of people's minds. And they want to know, can you talk a little bit about how your research, how the research takes into account neurodivergent people? And this person says, I know many autistic people, for example, that cannot socialize for long periods because it becomes overwhelming quickly. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how that would be?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. We did not study neurodivergent people because they went unrecognized, particularly in the World War II generation. And so I can't speak to that from my own scientific findings, but there are now much better studies of neurodivergent ways of approaching the world and how we can embrace that, right? So I would say there is other research. It's not something I can speak to from my own work.
Is the baby boomer study where you're studying the kids of the Harvard study, are they looking at any of those kind of topics, and how far along is that research, just PS?
So that research is 10 years underway. So we've got a lot of data now. Okay. What we think happens is that many of the neurodivergent people choose not to participate. We had an 82% participation rate, but we have not had many neurodivergent people at all. So our ability to study them is hampered by not having a critical mass to study.
Okay. All right, so quick answer. What about the role of pets in your happiness?
Well, some people mentioned pets, and that's fabulous. Like what we know, you can literally feel your body calm down when you pet a cat or a dog or another furry animal that you love. And so we have not systematically studied that, but there are studies underway. And what we know is that literally the physiology of reducing the fight or flight response, reducing the body's stress response is very clearly there when people are interacting with animals.
Okay. Remy wants to know, how does today's obsession with happiness and immediate gratification culture help us become more selfless, thinking of others more in our actions? So how does that work?
Okay. The obsession with happiness does not help us. So, first of all, the message is nobody's happy all the time. This fantasy that if we just do the right stuff, we'll be happy 24/7, that is just not the truth of any human life. But the work that talks about well-being, that talks about strengthening connections, that talks about finding purpose, and particularly purpose in the service of others and in the service of good causes in the world, that research on well-being is definitely contributing to how people begin to orient their lives. And I think we're seeing it in some of our younger adults who are saying, I don't want to just live with my nose to the grindstone. And I don't want to believe all this hype about consumerism making me happy. I want a life of purpose and meaning. So I think the research is making a dent in this.
Joshua is asking about the different settings of close relationships, the difference between close relationships with family versus friends versus work friends. Do you have some sense as to the relative contributions of those various friend groups or love groups?
It's highly individual. So for example, for some people, their sibling is their nearest and dearest person. For me, I have two cousins who are like my sisters. I don't know why. It's just that we chose each other, right? So within family, often people with certain affinities gather together, right? Find each other. And so there is no predictable set form for any of us for who we find that we get close to within, say, a large family group. It's highly individual.
There's a couple questions coming in about wondering about the impact of trauma, both in childhood and or adulthood, and how that impacts happiness and attention. And one person is mentioning attachment styles in adulthood have a powerful impact on relationships. So how does that factor in terms of childhood trauma in particular?
We did a lot of work on attachment, and what we found is that people with warmer connections to parents in childhood were more securely attached to their partners 60 years later. And finding that kind of connection across 60 years of life is almost unheard of. So it's a very strong effect. The trauma is devastating, not just because of the actions taken, but because trauma leaves children with a sense that the world isn't safe and people can't be relied upon. But what we find is that people can have corrective experiences as they grow up and as they get into adulthood, that people can have healing experiences by choosing friends and partners who are reliable, who are loving, who are not hurtful. And we have life stories in the book about this, that healing is possible, but trauma is, as we know, much, much too common in childhood and leaves a terrible legacy.
Yep. And kind of now I'm going to take you a little bit out of your book and maybe into your professional life a little bit with this next question. This is a difficult era for teens between the news headlines and social media. What's your best recommendation you have for teens to working through anxiety? I realize that's not your book per se or the Harvard study, but maybe if you could offer something. I think this is a lot on people's minds.
There are lots of good ways to work through anxiety. You can come at it in from many different directions. The first thing is don't be alone with it. That is the first thing. Talk to somebody. Talk to a parent. Talk to somebody you trust, a teacher, a coach, somebody who feel safe with. Tell them. Ask them to help you figure out your way through it. And then there are many ways. Therapy can really help. Talking to someone at a church, talking to a friend who's a good listener. There's medication, which can really help some people. So there are many different routes in, but the first thing to do is not be alone with it, to share it with a trustworthy person.
Okay. And on that note, we'll close out there. Anything you want to say as we close out, Bob, anything at all to everyone watching, the hundreds of people watching?
Yeah, I think just the other thing that we find, and there's actually a chapter in the book called It's Never Too Late, that these life stories tell us that people who thought, I'm no good at relationships, this is never going to happen for me, people find friends in late life, they find love in times and in situations they never expected to. So if you think that these things are never going to be part of your life, think again. You don't know what's going to happen as you go forward.
Okay, thank you so much. Arthur, hope to see you again at some point when the next, the printing presses gear back up for you. And Bob, a pleasure as well. Thanks everybody for coming. Hope to see you in 2 nights to see just another dynamic duo, Dacher Keltner and Susan Kane. That's going to be an amazing event as well. Thanks everybody. Thanks for engaging with our programming. We appreciate it.